Hello and welcome back to Holy Nerdvana. Today, we're testing the Forever Winter, version 0.1.39167.0, which came out around the beginning of November 2024. The game is a relatively recent early access release from September that seems to be at least somewhat reasonably popular, so we thought we'd run some benchmarks. Now stop us if you've heard this one before. Unreal Engine 5. Poor performance. Whoa, shocking, right? Performance at medium settings isn't terrible. We're getting around 60 FPS on the RX 6600, only 45 FPS on the RTX 3058GB. Of course, Nvidia's card is usually slower in most games, as the 6600 normally competes with the 306012GB card. So it's not too surprising that AMD comes out ahead. And the differences in colors, that's apparently due to AMD's H.264 encoder really messing things up. It just looks completely different, and it's not what you see if you're actually playing the game. Stepping up to the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 XT, we're seeing relatively similar performance, 77 frames per second on the 7600 XT and 72 frames per second on the 4060. But if you watch the real-time frame rates, you'll see some bigger discrepancies. That's due to the game engine and lack of optimizations. Right now, it's more than a little inconsistent about providing a steady frame rate. So even if we're standing still, looking down a basically static scene, you can see up to about a 20% fluctuation in performance from the low to the high. It's kind of crazy to see such a big discrepancy for doing what should be the same graphics workload, so there's definitely plenty of work to be done. Moving on to the RTX 4070 and the RX 7900 GRE, these start at around $500 to $550 depending on the day of the month. We expect to see a lot of sales come Black Friday that could push these GPUs into the $500, maybe even lower range. That's still pretty expensive, but it's the new definition of mid-range apparently. Thanks, inflation. The RX 7900 GRE definitely rates as the faster card of these two in rasterization workloads and in the Forever Winter. Also, this is Unreal Engine 5, so it does have the Lumen engine doing software ray tracing of a sort, but it doesn't leverage the RT hardware of the RTX cards and can be run poorly on cards that lack such hardware. Moving on, we have the RTX 4080 Super and the RX 7900 XTX. AMD's card has a clear advantage in performance right now, which is something we often see at 1080p and lower settings. AMD's drivers and cards just scale to higher performance levels, especially at the top with the RX 7900 XTX, so it's getting 162 frames per second on average, compared to only 138 FPS on the 4080 Super. Does that mean the 4080 Super is the worst card in all cases? No. But the XTX will generally deliver superior performance at lower settings and lower resolutions. As we move up to 1440p and 4K, we'll see the gap between the two GPUs narrow and even switch over to Nvidia. RTX 4090 against the 7900 XTX sees the same issues, with the Nvidia cards doing worse. We think it's driver limitations where Nvidia hits a performance bottleneck at a lower level. AMD has better threaded optimizations or something. So, we're getting 151 frames per second on the 4090, 162 on the XTX. Advantage AMD. In situations that aren't CPU limited, the 4090 should always beat the 7900 XTX, but 1080p medium settings just aren't its preferred arena. In the overall standings, AMD takes the top spot with the 7900 XTX. The RTX 4090's not too far ahead of the 4080 Super, indicating CPU and system bottlenecks. Next comes the 7900 GRE and the RTX 4070, with AMD in the lead. And the 7600 XT outpaces the 4060 by a little bit as well. And for $200 budget GPUs, the RX 6600 at the bottom easily beats the 3058GB card. Don't even bother with the 3056GB card. Let's go ahead and move up to Ultra settings, still at 1080p. One of the things you'll notice at Ultra settings compared to Medium is that, while superficially things look pretty similar, the shadows and lighting show some obvious differences. Lumen needs more computational rendering power at higher quality settings to produce a temporally stable image. So at medium, the lighting tends to flicker and shimmer more than it does with the ultra settings. Anyway, it's not worth testing the truly budget cards like the 6630-50, but you can see the 7600 XT and 4060 are tied at right around 36 frames per second. Moving up to the RTX 4070 and RX 7900 GRE, AMD still has a clear lead. Minimums are about the same, but AMD gets 67 FPS on average compared to 58 FPS on average for the 4070. That's not too surprising and is pretty typical for these two GPUs running a rasterization workload. There's not too much else to add. The game is playable at these settings on these cards, but we're only at 1080p Ultra. And you can already guess that performance will take a pretty big hit as we go up to the 1440p and 4K results. The RTX 4080 Super and RX 7900 XT are closer to parity now, though AMD still has a slight advantage, 92 FPS compared to 85 FPS. We should also note that this game only supports DLSS upscaling and frame generation right now. That could change over time. Unreal Engine has good support for FSR, DLSS, and even XeSS, so it's probably just a case of this being early access and the developers haven't taken the time yet to implement all of the different upscalers. They've got other fish to fry, like making more levels, getting rid of some of the jonkiness and the stuttering that you see with the movement of the enemies when you're out in the main world. Last we have the RTX 4090 and the 7900 XTX, and this time Nvidia's card does come out ahead. As mentioned earlier, if you stand still in this game and just look down a corridor or at the environment, you can see frame rates fluctuate quite a bit, up to around 20%. That's all while rendering the same scene, so it should be a steady FPS. Whatever is going on right now, there's definitely a lot of frame rate inconsistency happening with the forever winter that will need to be fixed. Anyway, the RTX 4090 does come out on top, which is pretty much to be expected on anything above medium settings at 1080p. Here's the chart showing the overall standings. We've got the 4090 at 102 FPS, 11% ahead of the 7900 XTX. AMD's fastest card is 8% ahead of the RTX 4080 Super that sits at 85 FPS. Then there's a bigger gap to the 7900 GRE at 67, RTX 4070 at 58, and we're tied on the 4060 and 7600 XT. That indicates that the game isn't requiring more than 8 GB of graphics memory, at least not at these settings. And at the bottom, we have the RX 6600 and RTX 3050, both struggling to reach a playable level, with the 3050 often running below 20 FPS. It's time to move on to 1440p testing, and we've dropped the 6630-50 from any further testing as they're not even remotely playable. Even the 7600 XT and 4060 struggle a lot at 1440p Ultra, and while we'll show them in the charts, we won't bother with the gameplay video of sub 30 FPS. Instead, we'll start 1440p testing with the 7900 GRE and the RTX 4070. AMD's getting about 50 frames per second compared to just 41 FPS on the 4070. So AMD, as usual, is delivering a better experience for their upper mid-range card. Unreal Engine 5 increasingly feels like a case of developers being able to get up and running quickly, but it takes more time and effort to optimize games and get them running well. For smaller teams, like the people behind the Forever Winter, it's both a blessing and a curse. Right now, the game performs very poorly on a lot of cards. Take the RTX 4080 Super and RX 7900 XTX, which are now getting around the same performance at 1440p. The game looks decent and runs pretty well, and it's definitely playable. Still, if you go outside, performance drops compared to what we're showing here inside the innards. But the innards works far better for benchmarking, as we don't have to load into a level, deal with enemies that wander around the maps, and other idiosyncrasies. And regardless of what we show now, it's a safe bet that performance will change a lot over time. The RTX 4090 and RX 7900 XTX are last up, and now the 4090 is finally able to stretch its legs a bit. It's 23% faster than the XTX at 1440p Ultra, 81 FPS compared to 66 FPS. Of course, it also costs about twice as much as the top AMD card, so this isn't meant to be a comparison between equivalent GPUs. We also wouldn't recommend going out and buying a 4090 at this juncture if you don't already have one, since it's widely rumored that we'll get the RTX 5090 and 5080 come January. And here's the chart for 1440p, 4090 at 81 FPS, the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX tied at around 65 FPS. AMD has the advantage with the GRE over the 4070, 50 to 41 at the $500 price point. And for the $300-ish cards, they're basically tied, though VRAM does seem to have more of an impact than at 1080p. AMD's 7600 XT has better minimum FPS, whereas the 4060 is down at 14, indicating a lot of stuttering on the 4060. But honestly, the game's not super playable at 1440p Ultra on the two budget cards. Let's wrap things up with native 4K Ultra testing. There's no sense in keeping the 4060 and 7600 XT around, so we're down to 5 cards. You can enable upscaling, as the game supports DLSS, but that feels like a crutch for so many games. Crappy performance. Turn on upscaling and frame generation rather than working to optimize the game levels and engine. Plus we want apples-to-apples comparisons for benchmarks, so the lack of FSR3 would unduly penalize AMD GPUs. The RTX 4070 and 7900 GRE are both technically playable at over 30 FPS, though the GRE averages 40 frames per second while the 4070 lands at just 33 FPS. Not the greatest experience, frankly, considering minimum FPS. But it's better than it was 2 weeks ago, thanks to a patch that improved performance around 10 to 15%. The RTX 4080 Super and RX 7900 XTX are about tied again, 55 FPS on the 4080 Super compared to 53 FPS on the XTX. So Nvidia now has the lead at 4K Ultra. And that's not because of memory capacity or bandwidth. The 4080 Super just has more compute power, and that comes into play at 4K. As for the RTX 4090, Nvidia comes out on top with 69 FPS and minimums of 56 FPS, so the minimum FPS ends up higher than the average FPS of the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX. You can see the real-time frame rates from our gameplay capture in the corner as well, which tends to be about 5% slower than the pure benchmarking runs due to video capture overhead. And as we said earlier, there are inexplicable fluctuations in performance that appear to come from a lack of optimizations and tuning. But we'll get back to that in a moment. Here's the final chart for 4K Ultra performance. The 4090 takes the pole position, 25% ahead of the 4080 Super. The 4080 Super and 7900 XTX are almost tied, Nvidia having a 4% lead on average FPS but a 16% lead on minimum FPS. And AMD still offers a much better value with the 7900 GRE over the 4070, with 21% higher performance. We could test AMD's RX 7800 XT, which costs about $50 less than the GRE, but in most games we find it runs about 15% slower, and so the 7900 GRE represents the better choice now. No wonder AMD didn't launch it until after the 7800 XT had been out for half a year. As far as frame rate fluctuations, we don't want to beat a dead and unoptimized horse too much, but we noticed fluctuations in performance just standing still during our benchmarks, especially on Nvidia GPUs. As an example, here's the RTX 4090 at 81 FPS, running 1080p Ultra. But as we just stand here, with nothing noticeable changing in the scene, we'll see performance increase up to 96 FPS or so. That's a huge swing, a 20% performance change doing nothing, and the same thing happens with other GPUs and other resolutions. Here's the 4090 at 1440p Ultra. This time we start at 65 FPS and reach as high as 76 FPS, a 17% delta. And that's the forever winter in a nutshell right now. It's an early access, and much could change in the coming months and maybe even years. There are plans for more maps, features, tuning, etc. And of course it has the usual early access bugs, performance issues, jank, and other items to address. But we hope you enjoyed this video. As always, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe for the YouTube algorithm gods, leave us a comment, and share our video around if you like seeing this sort of non-mainstream testing. And let us know in the comments what other games and graphics cards you'd like to see tested. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.